Welcome to the Glass Violin Mystery. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey. But before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1, The Voice of Glass, the fog that settled over London on the evening of November the 14th, 1895. Was of that suffocating variety which transforms even the most familiar streets into corridors of the unknown. Gas lamps became dim orange suggestions of themselves, and the clatter of hansom cabs arrived muffled and ghost-like, as though the city had been wrapped in damp cotton. I had drawn my chair close to the fire and was attempting to concentrate on a monograph concerning tropical fevers, when I became aware that Holmes had not moved in over an hour. He sat in his usual armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, grey eyes fixed upon a point beyond the ceiling. The pipe beside him had gone cold. The violin lay untouched in its case. These were signs I had learned to read as fluently as any medical chart. Sherlock Holmes was profoundly, dangerously bored. "You have read that monograph 3 times, Watson," he said, without moving his gaze. "You turn the pages at the same intervals, which tells me you are absorbing nothing." I set the monograph aside, though I confess the accuracy stung. "There has not been a case of genuine interest in 3 weeks," Holmes continued, his voice carrying that particular edge of restless irritation I knew so well. "Lestrade brought me a matter of a forged cheque last Tuesday, which a moderately attentive child could have resolved. The criminal classes of London have become disappointingly unambitious." It was at that moment, as though summoned by the force of Holmes's discontent, that we heard the street door open below and the heavy tread of boots upon the staircase. Mrs. Hudson's voice murmured something, and a deeper voice replied. Holmes straightened in his chair like a hound catching a scent. "Lestrade," he announced, moving quickly but not running. Urgent, but not an emergency. His left boot strikes harder than his right. He has been standing for some time, likely at a crime scene, and he has come directly from Mayfair. That mud is unmistakable. The door opened, and Inspector Lestrade entered, his sharp features arranged in that blend of professional pride and private bewilderment that preceded a request for Holmes's assistance. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." He removed his bowler hat. "I apologize for the hour." "You do not apologize for the hour, Lestrade. You apologize for the necessity," Holmes replied, gesturing to the basket chair. "Sit down. You have been at Lord Ashworth's residence in Curzon Street, and something has happened to his glass violin. Tell me everything." Lestrade froze mid-step. Even after all these years, Holmes's deductions could still arrest a man where he stood. "How on earth?" "Your coat carries a trace of a particular beeswax polish employed by Harding and Sons, who maintain only 4 households in London, 3 of which I can eliminate by the direction from which you arrived. And you have a fragment of glass caught in your left cuff, not common glass, but something finer, with an unusual translucence. The only object of glass significant enough to warrant a visit from Scotland Yard at this hour is La Voce di Vetro. Pray continue." Lestrade settled into the chair and drew a long breath. "It was the gala last night. Lord Ashworth had organised a grand unveiling. The violin was to be displayed publicly for the first time in 20 years. Very exclusive affair. 200 guests, musicians, enough champagne to drown a regiment. The violin was set up in a display case in the first-floor conservatory, all lit up with those new electric lights Ashworth had installed." "Electric lighting," Holmes murmured. "Recently installed." "Within the last 2 months, yes. Ashworth was very proud of it. The whole house wired up, every room blazing. It was quite the spectacle from what the guests tell us." Lestrade leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. Everything was proceeding beautifully. Ashworth himself was in the ballroom at 9 o'clock, giving a toast to his guests, and then, at 9:15 precisely, every light in the house went dark. The fire crackled. Holmes's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Complete blackout, Lestrade continued. Pitch darkness. Lasted about 90 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes. The accounts vary. Screaming, confusion, people stumbling about. And when the lights came back on, the display case in the conservatory was open and empty. The violin was gone. Gone, Holmes repeated quietly. Worse than gone, Mr. Holmes. Smashed to pieces on the conservatory floor. Glass everywhere. Shards scattered across the marble, ground into the carpet. The thief apparently took it from the case and dashed it to the floor before making his escape. Destroyed it outright. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, and he rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like something alive. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity, that rare spark which transformed him from a languid, restless figure into the most formidable reasoning mind in England. Why, Watson, would a thief go to the extraordinary trouble of stealing a priceless object, only to smash it on the floor? Spite is the refuge of the unimaginative. This was something else entirely. I confess the question had not occurred to me in those terms, but once Holmes framed it, the strangeness of the act became immediately apparent. Perhaps the thief was interrupted, I ventured. Panicked when the lights returned. 90 seconds of darkness, Watson. An eternity for a prepared man. More than sufficient to exit through any of several doors or windows. No, a thief who engineers a blackout, for I think we may safely assume this was no coincidence of timing, has planned his escape as carefully as his entry. He would not destroy the very object he came to steal unless the destruction itself served a purpose. Holmes turned back to Lestrade. The violin. Tell me its history. Lestrade consulted a small notebook. La Voce di Vetro, the voice of glass. Created in 1743 by a Venetian glassblower named Marcello Contarini. For the daughter of a doge. One of a kind. It passed through various hands during the Napoleonic Wars and was acquired by the Ashworth family in 1811. And its value? Insured for £45,000. I nearly choked on my brandy. £45,000. Enough to purchase several estates, to fund a hospital, to live in luxury for a lifetime. The insurance company, Holmes said. It was not a question. Lestrade nodded. The Northern Continental Assurance Company. They've engaged their own investigators and put pressure on the Yard. Ashworth filed his claim this morning. Expedient of him. He says he wishes to resolve the matter quickly. He is, by all accounts, devastated. Barely slept, according to his secretary. Holmes returned to his chair and sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. I recognized this posture, the external stillness that accompanied the most furious internal activity. The guests, Holmes said. Were there notable figures present? Half of Mayfair, but a few names came up repeatedly. Lestrade flipped a page. A Contessa Visconti, Italian woman, made quite a scene, claimed the violin was stolen from her family and demanded its return. She was seen near the display room during the blackout. Interesting. Who else? A Madame Zhao, Chinese lady, very wealthy, known collector of rare instruments. She was overheard offering Ashworth a considerable sum for the violin during the evening, and being flatly refused. And then there's Ashworth's own private secretary, a Mr. Phineas Locke, who managed the entire evening's arrangements and had keys to every room in the house. A passionate claimant, a determined buyer, and a trusted servant with total access, Holmes mused. Each with the means, each with a motive of sorts. How very convenient. Something in his tone made me look up. There was a quality to those last words, a faint, almost sardonic edge, that suggested Holmes was already looking past the obvious suspects towards something the rest of us could not yet see. "You will take the case?" Lestrade asked with an eagerness he could not entirely disguise. Holmes reached for his pipe and began to fill it with slow, deliberate precision. "I will examine the scene tomorrow morning, ensure that nothing is disturbed, The shards on the floor, the display case, the windows, the doors, the electrical system. Touch nothing, Lestrade. Even the dust has a story to tell in this matter. I'll see to it personally. One further question. The temporary staff hired for the evening, footmen, kitchen workers, additional servants, were they vetted? Lestrade hesitated. They were brought in through an agency. 6 extra footmen, I believe. Standard practice for an event of that size. Obtain their names and addresses. All of them. Lestrade stood. Eyre replaced his hat and moved toward the door with the relief of a man transferring a burden to stronger shoulders. He paused at the threshold. You think there's more to this, Mr. Holmes? Holmes struck a match and held it to his pipe. The flame illuminated his sharp features in the dim room, casting long shadows across the wall behind him. There is nothing simple about this, Inspector. A priceless object, insured for a fortune. Stolen during an engineered blackout at a gala attended by 200 witnesses, then apparently destroyed on the spot, and an insurance claim filed before the glass has even been swept from the floor. He drew on the pipe, and the tobacco glowed amber. No, Lestrade, this is not a theft. This is a performance, and I am very much interested in meeting the playwright. The door closed behind the inspector. The fog pressed at the windows. Holmes smoked in silence for several minutes, and I knew better than to interrupt. At last he spoke, more to himself than to me. £45,000, Watson, the sum a man might kill for, or perhaps more instructively, the sum a man might stage an elaborate theatrical production to collect. He reached for the newspapers. We shall visit Curzon Street at first light. I suspect that when we examine that shattered glass, it will have a very interesting tale to tell. I retired to bed with the distinct impression that the fog outside was not the only thing concealing something from view. Somewhere in the cold November night, a glass violin, or what remained of it, held the answer to a question I had not yet learned to ask. Chapter 2. The Shattered Song. We departed Baker Street the following morning, under a sky the colour of spent gunpowder. The fog had thinned but not retreated, clinging to the rooftops of Mayfair in pale ribbons as our hansom turned into Curzon Street. Lord Ashworth's residence announced itself before we reached the door, a grand Georgian townhouse of Portland stone, its facade adorned with Ionic pilasters and tall windows that spoke of old money and older pride. Lestrade met us in the entrance hall, a vaulted space of black and white marble, crystal chandelier overhead, the faint chemical residue of the new electrical installation hanging in the air. Nothing has been disturbed, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade said, as you requested. Holmes said nothing. He was already looking, not at Lestrade, not at the grand staircase or the portraits lining the hall, but at the floor. His grey eyes swept the tiles with that particular intensity I had witnessed 100 times, the gaze of a man reading a language invisible to the rest of us. He knelt without warning and pressed his cheek nearly to the marble, examining the surface at an acute angle. 14 sets of footprints crossed this hall since last evening's cleaning, he murmured. 12 belong to the household, standard domestic shoes, well worn. 2 are distinctive. One is a heavy boot with a military tread, yours, Lestrade. The other is a lighter shoe, soft-soled, almost silent. A man who moved through this house like a cat. He rose and brushed his knee. The conservatory, if you please. We ascended to the first floor and entered the display room, a long, elegant space with tall windows overlooking a private garden. Potted palms stood in brass urns along the walls. A grand piano occupied one corner. At the centre, upon a mahogany pedestal, stood the display case, polished wood and beveled glass, its door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The case was empty. The floor was not. Glass shards lay scattered across the marble in a rough arc extending perhaps 8 feet from the pedestal. Some fragments were large, curved pieces still suggesting the shape of an instrument, while others were ground to near powder, glittering like frost under the grey window light. Holmes produced his lens and knelt beside the debris. For several minutes he moved among the shards with the delicate precision of a surgeon, lifting fragments, turning them, holding them to the light. He withdrew a long pin from his lapel and tapped several pieces in succession, inclining his head close to each one with his eyes half shut. I watched him repeat this procedure with 5 separate shards. After the 5th, he placed the pin back in his lapel and remained crouching, perfectly still, for a long moment. "Watson," he said quietly, "come here." I knelt beside him. He held up 2 shards, one larger, slightly curved, the other a flat splinter. "Tap this one," he said, handing me the pin and indicating the curved piece. I did so. It produced a faint, clear ring, a surprisingly musical sound, bright and lingering. "Now, this one." The flat splinter rang differently. The note was duller, shorter, with a coarser quality that even my untrained ear could distinguish. Venetian cristallo of the 18th century contained specific trace minerals. Manganese dioxide, soda ash derived from Mediterranean sea plants, Holmes said, rising to his feet. "It produces a particular resonance when struck, a whisper almost. These shards sing a different tune, Watson, a coarser tune. This glass is not 18th century Venetian. It is modern, and it is not all from the same object." He pocketed 3 fragments in a small envelope and turned his attention to the display case itself, examining the lock, the hinges, the interior felt lining. He ran his fingers along the velvet where the violin had rested and brought them to his nose. Recently cleaned, lemon oil and a trace of camphor. Someone polished this case within the last week, thoroughly, as if removing traces of something. He opened and closed the glass door twice, testing the mechanism. The lock is undamaged. Either it was opened with a key, or it was never locked at all. I made note of these observations while Holmes moved to the windows, 3 tall sash windows with brass latches. He examined each in turn. At the 3rd, farthest from the door, he paused and leaned close. "This window has been opened recently. The paint around the latch shows a fresh crack, not broken, but stressed. And the sill has scuff marks. Something was rested here, or dragged across." He leaned out and looked down into the narrow alley below, but said nothing more. We were interrupted by the arrival of Lord Sebastian Ashworth himself. He entered the conservatory with the measured stride of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. He was tall, perhaps 50, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and the kind of handsome, angular face that portrait painters favour. He wore a dark morning coat, impeccably tailored, and his bearing radiated the quiet authority of inherited wealth. But it was his eyes that drew my attention. Pale blue, steady, watchful. They were the eyes of a man performing a role and performing it well. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." His voice was deep, controlled, tinged with precisely the right measure of dignified grief. "I cannot express how grateful I am that you have agreed to look into this dreadful business. La Voce di Vetro was not merely an object of value, it was the soul of this family's collection. Its losses—" He paused, pressing his lips together. "It is devastating." Holmes regarded him with an expression of polite interest that revealed nothing. "You have my sympathies, Lord Ashworth. I wonder if you might walk me through the events of that evening in your own words." Ashworth recounted the gala with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed his account. The guests arriving from 8 o'clock, the violin displayed under the new electric lights, champagne and music, the Contessa's unfortunate outburst at 8:45, his own toast to the guests beginning at 9. Then the darkness. "I was mid-sentence when every light in the house went out," he said. "Absolute blackness. The ladies screamed. I called for calm and instructed the servants to bring candles. It could not have lasted more than 2 minutes, but it felt interminable. When the lights returned, I came directly here and found—" He gestured at the glass on the floor. This. And your immediate reaction? Horror. Disbelief. I stood in this doorway and could not move. My secretary Locke was the one who telephoned for the police. You did not attempt to gather the fragments? To examine the damage? A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed Ashworth's face. I could not bring myself to touch them. It was as though a member of my family had been murdered before my eyes. Holmes nodded slowly. One further question, Lord Ashworth. The display case. Was it locked during the gala? Of course. I locked it myself at 7:30 before the first guests arrived. And I have the only key. He produced a small brass key from his waistcoat pocket and placed it on the pedestal. Holmes picked it up, examined it briefly and returned it. Thank you. That will be all for the moment. Ashworth departed with a slight bow, and Holmes watched him go with an expression I could not entirely read. Not suspicion exactly, but something adjacent to it. A kind of careful attention, as one might watch a card player whose hands move a fraction too smoothly. We found Phineas Locke in the study, a thin, anxious man of perhaps 35, with receding hair and the permanent stoop of someone who spent his life at a desk. He rose sharply when we entered, nearly knocking over an inkwell. Anything you need, Mr. Holmes. I have the guest list, the staff roster, the floor plans. I prepared everything for the inspector. Lord Ashworth relies upon me for all matters of organisation. I managed every detail of the evening. If there was a breach in security, I feel partly responsible. Holmes listened with apparent patience, his gaze dropping to Locke's hands. The inkstains on his cuffs were fresh, blacker, and more extensive than routine correspondence would produce. The faint smell of burned paper lingered in the room. Mr. Locke, who had access to the electrical system on the night of the gala? Locke blinked. The electrician, Mr. Hargreaves, was not present that evening. I suppose any of the household staff could have accessed the basement where the fuse box is located. It was unlocked during preparations. And you yourself? I was in the kitchen corridor at the time of the blackout, coordinating the second course. Several kitchen staff can confirm it. Holmes thanked him, and we departed. In the hansom on the way back to Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence for some time, his chin resting on his chest, his fingers drumming a soft rhythm on his knee. Well, Watson, what did you make of our host? I considered carefully. He seemed genuinely distressed. His account was clear and consistent. Clear and consistent, Holmes repeated. Yes, remarkably so. The account of a man who has lived through a traumatic event is rarely so polished. Shock produces confusion, repetition, gaps in memory. Ashworth's narrative was a finished composition, every note in its proper place, every rest precisely timed. He turned to the window. And did you observe his hands? His hands? When he spoke of discovering the shattered glass, the remains of an instrument he called the soul of his family's collection, his hands were perfectly steady, not a tremor. A man who truly loved that violin would have wept over those shards. He would have gathered every fragment with his bare hands. Ashworth looked at the broken glass on his conservatory floor with the detachment of a man looking at a mess he himself had made. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. You suspect Ashworth? I suspect the glass, Watson. The glass tells me it is not what it claims to be, and in my experience, when the evidence wears a disguise, someone has dressed it so. He drew his coat tighter. Tomorrow I shall return to that conservatory alone. There is a window that has a story to tell, and I mean to hear it. Chapter 3. The Curtain's Secret. Holmes returned to Curzon Street the following afternoon without me. He offered no explanation, merely announced over breakfast that he intended to conduct a secondary examination, and that my presence, while always valued, was not required. I recognized the tone. There were moments when Holmes needed to be entirely alone with a space, to commune with it without the distraction of even sympathetic company. I spent the morning at my practice in Paddington. It was nearly 4 o'clock when I returned to Baker Street and found Holmes in his armchair, coat still damp from the drizzle, scraps of paper spread on the side table, and an expression of quiet satisfaction on his features. "You found something," I said. "I found everything, Watson. Sit down. You will want to hear this." He filled his pipe and began. "I arrived at the house at 1:30. Ashworth was out, attending to business at his solicitor's, according to the staff. Locke was in the study, but did not trouble me. I made directly for the conservatory and locked the door behind me." He struck a match and held it to the bowl. "You will recall the third window, the one with the stressed latch and the scuffed sill. I began there. The curtains flanking that window are heavy green velvet, hung from an ornamental brass rod. Decorative finials at each end, quite handsome. The sort of detail one glances at and dismisses. I did not dismiss it." He leaned forward. "I examined the rod itself. The exterior is polished brass, well maintained, consistent with the rest of the room's fittings. But when I looked more closely, from below, at an angle the household staff would never think to dust, I found faint parallel scratches running along the interior channel of the rod. Fresh scratches, Watson. The brass beneath the patina was bright and clean where something had scored it." "Something threaded through the rod?" "Precisely. A thin wire or cord run through the hollow interior of the curtain rod from one end to the other. I unscrewed the left finial and found the rod to be entirely hollow, not solid brass as it appears, but a tube. Inside I discovered faint traces of wire residue. Someone had converted that decorative rod into a functional pulley channel." He rose and moved to the mantelpiece, where he had laid out his scraps of paper. On one he had sketched a rough diagram, the window, the rod above it, a dotted line descending from the rod through the open window to the alley below. "The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity," he continued. "A wire threaded through the rod, one end attached to the object to be lowered, the other controlled by the operator standing at the window. The object, in this case a violin, is suspended from the wire, guided over the rod acting as a pulley wheel, and lowered smoothly out the window to an accomplice waiting in the alley below. The entire operation could be completed in 30 seconds by a man with steady hands." "During the blackout," I said. "During the blackout. 90 seconds of darkness. More than sufficient. The operator lowers the violin, the accomplice receives it below, and the evidence of the mechanism is invisible to anyone who does not think to unscrew a curtain rod finial. But the glass on the floor was planted, pre-broken glass, carried into the room and scattered to simulate the destruction of the violin. The shards we examined yesterday are not from the original instrument. We have already established that. They were brought in specifically to create the illusion that the violin was smashed during the theft. The entire scene in the conservatory was staged. I sat back in my chair, the implications settling over me. Then the violin was not destroyed. The violin was never in danger, Watson. It was removed from the building, lowered out a first-floor window, received in the alley, and transported away. The destruction was a fiction, a very carefully constructed fiction. You said you descended to the alley yesterday, but found little. I found little yesterday because I was not yet looking for the right things. Today I went down again, this time with the pulley mechanism in mind. The alley is narrow, barely 6 feet across, and paved with old stone. But against the wall, directly beneath the window, I found 2 marks. First, a pair of shallow scuffs on the stone where something heavy was set down. Something with a flat rectangular base, a case of some kind. Second, and more telling, a small deposit of fine brass dust in the gap between 2 paving stones. Brass filings, Watson, shed from the wire as it ran through the rod under tension. The wind and rain had not yet washed them away. He returned to his chair. The violin was lowered into a waiting case in the alley. From there, it was carried away, but by whom, and to where, I do not yet know. That is the next question. I was struck, as I so often was, by the completeness of Holmes's reconstruction, the way he could stand in an empty room and see the ghost of an event that had already passed. But something else nagged at me. Holmes, this level of preparation, the hollow rod, the wire, the pre-broken glass, the timing of the blackout, this was not the work of an opportunist. Someone planned this weeks in advance. Months, I should think. The curtain rod was not modified on the night of the gala. The scratches inside are consistent with repeated testing. The wire was threaded and withdrawn several times before the actual event. Our architect rehearsed. Then we must consider who had prolonged access to that room. Holmes regarded me with something approaching approval. Now you are asking the right question. Who had access to the conservatory in the weeks and months preceding the gala? The household staff, certainly. But they would have no motive and no expertise. Locke, the secretary, had keys to every room. But Locke is a creature of ledgers and letters, not of pulleys and wires. The Contessa arrived in London only a week before the event. Which leaves Ashworth himself. Which leaves Ashworth himself, Holmes echoed. The owner of the house, the keeper of the keys, the man who installed new electrical lighting 2 months ago, requiring workmen and disruption that would provide perfect cover for modifications to a curtain rod. The man who arranged the gala chose the display room, positioned the violin beneath that specific window. He paused, and I saw him check himself. That rare moment when Holmes reined in his own certainty. But we must be careful, Watson. Suspicion is not evidence. Ashworth is the most logical candidate. But logic without proof is merely opinion. We need more. What about the other suspects? The Contessa, Madame Zhao? I have not forgotten them. He consulted a small notebook. The Contessa Eleonora Visconti is a descendant of the Contarini family, the original glassblowers who created La Voce di Vetro. She has campaigned publicly for the violin's return to Italy for nearly a decade. Her outburst at the gala was the culmination of years of frustration. A powerful motive. On the surface. But the Contessa wants the violin returned to Venice, displayed publicly, celebrated as her family's legacy. Stealing it achieves nothing. She could never display it. Destroying it would be sacrilege against her own heritage. Her motive does not align with the method we have uncovered. Nevertheless, her presence near the display room during the blackout requires explanation. And Madame Zhao? Madame Lian Zhao is a more intriguing figure. A collector of rare instruments, ruthless, methodical, extremely wealthy. She was overheard offering Ashworth a private sum for the violin and being refused. Her attendant was observed moving through the service corridors during the evening. She could have arranged the theft. She could have. She has the resources, the connections, and the temperament. But the mechanism we have discovered, the modified curtain rod, the rehearsed wire system, requires prolonged access to the house. Zhao arrived in London 10 days before the gala and was staying at the Langham Hotel. She had no access to the conservatory before the evening itself. Holmes tapped his pipe against the ashtray. And then there is the question that troubles me most, Watson. The man who authenticated the violin before the gala, a luthier named Tobias Crowe. He spent 3 full days alone with the instrument, examining it, cleaning it. If anyone would have noticed something amiss, it would be Crowe. Yet he certified it as genuine and said nothing. Perhaps he noticed nothing. Perhaps. Or perhaps he noticed everything and chose to remain silent. I think a visit to Mr. Crowe's workshop is very much in order. He fell silent, staring into the fire. I could see the case taking shape behind his eyes, not yet complete, but the outline emerging, like a figure stepping slowly out of fog. "There is one more thing," he said quietly. "When I was in the alley this afternoon, I noticed something I did not mention. On the wall opposite the window, at roughly the height of a man's shoulder, there was a smear of white chalk. Fresh. The kind a workman might use to mark a position, or the kind an accomplice might use to mark exactly where to stand in a dark alley, on a dark night, to receive a package lowered from above. He met my gaze. This was not a crime of passion, Watson. This was a campaign, planned, rehearsed, and executed with military precision. And the general, I'm increasingly convinced, was not some outsider who breached the walls. The general was already inside the fortress. The fire crackled and settled. Outside, the November wind drove rain against the windows of Baker Street, and somewhere in Mayfair, a man sat in a grand house surrounded by the shards of a violin that had never been his to destroy. Chapter 4. The Cellist Who Wasn't. I awoke the next morning to find Holmes already dressed and pacing the sitting room with the coiled energy of a man who has solved half a puzzle and cannot rest until he has solved the other half. An untouched breakfast sat on the table. A map of Mayfair was spread across the sofa, marked with pencil annotations. Watson, good. I need your eyes today. My eyes? Your talent for noticing what is ordinary. And I have a tendency to look for the extraordinary and occasionally overlook the mundane. You are my corrective lens. He said this without condescension. It was a genuine compliment. We are going to examine the logistics of the evening. Not the crime itself, but the machinery around it. The comings and goings, the doors and ledgers. Somewhere in the ordinary traffic of that night, our violin made its exit. We returned to Curzon Street within the hour. Holmes bypassed the main entrance entirely and led me around the service entrance at the rear of the house, where deliveries were received and staff came and went. A narrow corridor connected this entrance to the kitchens and the servants' hall. It was here, Holmes explained, that the evening's logistics had been managed. Crates of champagne delivered, musicians' equipment received, temporary staff admitted. The doorman, Mr. Albert Briggs, was a meticulous older gentleman with white side whiskers and the upright bearing of a former military man. He occupied a small porter's room beside the service entrance, and regarded us with the cautious dignity of a man who took his responsibilities with the utmost seriousness. "I have kept the door log for Lord Ashworth's household for 11 years, Mr. Holmes," he said, producing a large leather-bound ledger from a shelf behind his chair. "Every person, every delivery, every item of consequence that enters or leaves this house passes through my record. It is a point of professional pride." "A commendable practice," Holmes said. "I should like to examine your entries for the evening of the gala, from, shall we say, 6 o'clock in the evening until midnight." Briggs opened the ledger to the relevant page and laid it before us on the porter's desk. The entries were written in a precise, angular hand, each line recording a time, a name or description, the nature of the item or business, and whether the entry was inward or outward. Holmes studied the page with intense concentration, his finger tracing each line. I leaned in beside him and began reading the entries myself, not entirely certain what I was looking for, but determined to justify Holmes's faith in my ordinary eyes. The record was thorough. At 6:15 p.m., 3 crates of Pol Roger champagne received from Berry Brothers. At 6:30, the florist's delivery, 12 arrangements of white roses and ferns. At 6:45, the first of the temporary footmen arrived, checked in by name. At 7 o'clock, the caterer's staff, with warming trays and provisions. At 7:30, the Belmont Ensemble arrived with their instruments, and here Briggs had noted, with admirable specificity, the items they carried. 2 violin cases, 1 viola case, 1 cello case, and a small trunk of sheet music and stands. I read the line again, then I read it a third time. "Holmes," I said. He looked up from a later entry he had been examining. "The musicians, the Belmont Ensemble. Briggs has logged their equipment as 2 violin cases, 1 viola case, and 1 cello case." "Yes." but Lestrade told us the ensemble consisted of 2 violinists, a violist, and a pianist. There was no cellist. Holmes went very still. His eyes moved to the entry, read it, and then lifted to meet mine. A smile, rare, genuine, and deeply satisfied, spread across his face. "Watson, you're a treasure." He turned to Briggs. "Mr. Briggs, you're quite certain of this entry? A cello case?" "Absolutely certain, sir. Large black case, rectangular, carried in by one of the footmen along with the other instrument cases. I remember because it was awkward in the corridor, nearly didn't fit through the service door, had to be turned sideways. And the outward log was a cello case recorded leaving." Briggs turned the page. "The outward entries began after the chaos of the blackout. Staff departures, police arrivals, guests leaving in haste. At 9:45 p.m, Briggs had logged musicians' equipment removed, 2 violin cases, 1 viola case, 1 cello case, 1 trunk. Carried out by household footman to waiting cab. The cello case entered at 7:30 and departed at 9:45, Holmes said quietly. It came in with the musicians and left with the musicians, and yet there was no cellist." Briggs frowned. "I simply recorded what I saw, sir. I had no reason to question whether the musicians required a cello. That was not my concern." "No, and you performed your duty admirably. One further question. The footman who carried the cello case in. Can you describe him?" Briggs considered. "I cannot say I paid him particular attention, sir. He was one of the temporary men, hired through the agency for the evening. Dark hair, I think. Moved well. Quick and quiet. I remember he handled the case with unusual care, as though it contained something fragile." Holmes thanked Briggs warmly and we withdrew to the service corridor. Once out of earshot, Holmes gripped my arm with an energy that startled me. "Do you see it, Watson? The cello case is the key. A violin, even a glass one, would fit perfectly inside a cello case, with room to spare for padding. The case enters the house openly, carried by a footman. During the blackout, the violin is lowered from the conservatory window via the pulley, received in the alley, and placed into the cello case which has been brought down from the house. Then the case is carried back inside through the service entrance, or simply walked out the front with the rest of the musicians' equipment when the evening dissolves into chaos." "Walked out the front door," I repeated, "in plain sight." "The best hiding place is often in plain sight, and no one questions a cello case leaving with the musicians. It is expected. It is mundane, and that is precisely why it succeeds." We spent the next hour tracking down the Belmont Ensemble. They were based in a rehearsal room above a music shop in Wigmore Street. We found 3 of the 4 members: Mr. Edward Marsh, first violin, Mr. Samuel Oakes, second violin, and Miss Catherine Price, viola. Marsh, a tall man with an untidy beard, confirmed what we suspected. We brought 2 violin cases, a 1 viola case and a trunk for our music. No cello. We are a quartet. Piano, not cello. "You did not notice an additional instrument case among your equipment?" Holmes asked. Marsh exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Our cases were handled by the footman when we arrived. They carried everything in from the cab. We simply went to the drawing room where we were to perform. When we departed, well, it was rather chaotic by then. The police were everywhere. The footman loaded our things back into the cab and we left. I cannot say I counted the cases." Miss Price, a sharp-eyed woman who had been listening with growing attention, spoke up. "I noticed something, actually. When we were leaving, one of the footmen was carrying a large case, larger than any of ours, toward the service entrance rather than toward our cab. I thought it odd, but assumed it belonged to the household. There was so much confusion." "Can you describe this footman?" "Only that he moved very quickly and did not speak. Dark hair, that is all I recall." Holmes nodded. "You have been most helpful." In the cab returning to Baker Street, Holmes was animated in a way I had not seen since the early days of the case. He sat forward on the seat, his hands clasped between his knees, constructing the sequence aloud. The cello case was brought into the house at 7:30. Disguised as part of the musician's equipment. It was empty, or contained only padding. During the blackout at 9:15, the accomplice lowered the violin from the conservatory window via the pulley system. An associate in the alley received it and placed it in the cello case. The case was then carried back through the service entrance and placed with the musician's equipment. At 9:45 it walked out the front door, or logged by the doorman as part of the ensemble's departure. Audacity, I said. Audacity and precision. Every step planned, every contingency accounted for. The doorman records the case entering and leaving. It appears in the ledger as entirely legitimate. No one questions it because no one has reason to. The violin leaves the house in a case that was always supposed to be there. He paused, his expression shifting. But this raises a critical question, Watson. The accomplice, the man who operated the pulley, who carried the case, who moved through the house like a shadow. He was not a guest. He was not a regular servant. He was one of the temporary footmen hired for the evening. The one Briggs described. Dark-haired, quiet, careful with the case. Yes. And he is the thread that, when pulled, will unravel the entire garment. Holmes rapped on the cab ceiling and called to the driver to take us to Scotland Yard. I need Lestrade to obtain the full records from the staffing agency. Names, addresses, references for every temporary man hired that evening. Somewhere in that list is our phantom footman, and when we find him, we find the hand that moved the pieces. But the mind that designed the game, that, Watson, is a different quarry altogether. The cab rattled through the darkening streets. I thought of the cello case, that prosaic, unremarkable object, walking through the front door of Lord Ashworth's mansion, while 200 guests milled about in shock, while police swarmed the conservatory, while Ashworth himself stood amid shattered glass and performed the role of a devastated man. The violin had passed within feet of all of them, hidden inside the most ordinary disguise imaginable. It was, I had to admit, rather brilliant, and that brilliance, I was beginning to understand, was precisely what troubled Holmes most. Chapter 5. The Luthier's Silence. The workshop of Tobias Crow occupied the upper floor of a narrow building in Clerkenwell, wedged between a locksmith and a purveyor of surgical instruments. The stairs were steep, the walls stained with damp, and the air thick with varnish, wood shavings and linseed oil. Every penny spent on the craft, none on appearances. Holmes had been unusually quiet during the cab ride. He had spent the previous evening in his chemical corner, subjecting the glass fragments to tests involving acids and a spectroscope borrowed from St. Bartholomew's. I had heard him murmur "Bohemian" twice, and seen him circle something in a reference volume on European glass-making. Whatever he had confirmed, it had sharpened his focus. Crow answered our knock with a guarded expression. He was perhaps 55, compact and wiry, with powerful scarred hands and eyes that held the intensity of a craftsman who saw the world in tolerances and microns. His workshop was a revelation. Instruments hung from walls and rested on felt-lined benches. A half-restored viola lay open on the central table like a patient on a surgical slab. Tools of exquisite precision were arranged with the orderliness of an operating theatre. "Mr. Holmes, I wondered when you would come." He did not offer us seats. There were none to offer. "You know who I am?" "Everyone in London who reads a newspaper knows who you are. And I have been following the Ashworth matter with some interest." His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man choosing each word with the precision he applied to his work. "Then you know why I am here. You were engaged to authenticate La Voce di Vetro before the gala." 3 days of examination, a thorough commission. I was. Lord Ashworth hired me personally. The violin was to be displayed publicly for the first time in 20 years. And the insurance company required a current authentication before the event. I am one of perhaps 5 people in England qualified to assess an instrument of that nature. And your assessment? A silence fell. Crow turned away and moved to a bench where a set of calipers lay beside a jeweller's loop. He picked up the loop, turned it over in his scarred fingers, set it down again. The gesture was not one of thought, but of avoidance. I certified the instrument as genuine, he said, but is still facing the bench. I provided Lord Ashworth with a written statement of authenticity, which was forwarded to the insurance company. That is what you told Lord Ashworth, Holmes said evenly. I'm asking you what you found. Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear the locksmith working below us, the rhythmic scratch of a file on metal, steady as a heartbeat. Mr. Crow, Holmes continued, his voice quiet but carrying an edge I recognized. It was the tone he used when patience was being deployed as a tool rather than offered as a courtesy. I have spent 2 days examining the remains of what was presented as la Voce di Vetro. I have tested the glass shards from the conservatory floor. I know their composition. I know they are not 18th century Venetian cristallo. I know they are modern glass, almost certainly of Czech or Bohemian origin. And I know that you, with 3 days of direct examination, your expertise, and your instruments, you knew it too. Crow's shoulders tightened. He stood motionless for several seconds, and then something in him gave way, not dramatically, not with any theatrical collapse, but with the quiet deflation of a man setting down a weight he could no longer carry. He turned to face us. His expression was not guilty. It was afraid. Yes, he said. I knew. He moved to a cabinet at the far end of the workshop and withdrew a leather portfolio, tied with cord. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it and laid its contents on the bench. Several pages of densely written notes, accompanied by detailed pencil sketches and a series of measurements recorded to fractions of a millimetre. These are my private authentication notes. The real ones, not the summary I provided to Lord Ashworth. Holmes took the pages and studied them with rapid, consuming attention. I looked over his shoulder. The notes were meticulous. Crow had documented every aspect of the violin's construction: dimensions, weight, surface texture, light refraction, acoustic resonance. And amid the technical measurements, certain entries were marked with small crosses in red ink. Here, Crow said, pointing to a passage near the middle of the first page. Micro-fracture patterns along the neck. 18th century Venetian cristallo develops a specific pattern of stress fractures over 2 centuries. Irregular, organic, are following the natural grain of the mineral inclusions. The fractures I observed were too regular, too uniform, consistent with accelerated aging techniques, thermal cycling, chemical treatment. Someone had artificially aged the glass. He turned to the second page, and here. The body of the violin was constructed in 2 halves and fused along a central seam. The seam was nearly invisible, extraordinarily fine work, but it was there. Contarini did not work in halves. His technique was to blow and shape a single continuous form. The 2-half method is a modern approach, used in Czech glassworks to achieve complex shapes that would be impossible with traditional blowing. No one working in 1743 would have used it. Holmes looked up from the notes. You found these anomalies during your 3-day examination. You documented them in detail. And then you wrote a certificate of authenticity and told Lord Ashworth the violin was genuine. Crow's jaw tightened. I was afraid, Mr. Holmes. If I declared it a fake, who would be blamed? The man who had just spent 3 days alone with the instrument. I could hear the accusation. Crow switched it. Crow replaced the original with a forgery. Who would they believe? A lord or a luthier? I told myself the anomalies might have explanations, he continued. That perhaps I was wrong. But I was not wrong. I've handled thousands of instruments. I know the difference between age and artifice. That violin was a reproduction, perhaps the finest I've ever seen. But a reproduction. Holmes set down the notes and regarded Crow with an expression that was not unkind. How long before the gala did you conduct your examination? 3 weeks. I had the violin for 3 days, returned it, and submitted my certificate 5 days later. And during those 3 days, the violin was in your workshop? No. Lord Ashworth was very particular about that. The examination was conducted at Curzon Street, in a room set aside for the purpose. I was given a workbench, my instruments, and full access. But the violin never left the house. Holmes turned to me, and in his eyes I saw the case shift. Not a small adjustment, but a fundamental reorientation, as though the ground itself had moved beneath our feet. Watson, do you understand the significance of what Mr. Crow has told us? I considered carefully. The violin Crow examined was already a replica, which means the real violin had been removed from the display before Crow ever saw it. Precisely. The swap did not occur on the night of the gala. It occurred weeks or months before, long before the blackout, the pulley system, the cello case. Everything that happened at the party was theatre. An elaborate, meticulously staged performance designed to create the appearance of a theft that had, in truth, already taken place. The implications cascaded. If the real violin had been replaced before Crow's examination, then the gala, the blackout, the smashed glass, the screaming guests was an illusion. The thief had stolen the violin weeks earlier, at leisure, with no witnesses. The gala was the cover story, the moment the violin was declared stolen and destroyed, allowing the insurance claim to proceed. But who had access to the violin in the weeks before Crow's examination, I asked. Holmes's gaze was steady. The household staff, who would have neither means nor motive, the secretary Locke, who had access but not the expertise, and the owner of the house, who had all three, access, means, and time to plan without suspicion. He turned back to Crow. Mr. Crow, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it with absolute honesty. During your examination at Curzon Street, did Lord Ashworth visit you? Did he observe your work? Did he ask about your findings? Crow nodded slowly. He came to the examination room twice, once on the first day to see that I was settled, and once on the third day to ask how the authentication was proceeding. He was pleasant, confident. He asked if the violin was everything he believed it to be. Crow paused. He asked it the way a man asks a question when he already knows the answer. Holmes gathered the authentication notes and placed them carefully inside his coat. Mr. Crow, these notes may prove to be the most important documents in this entire investigation. I will ensure they are kept safe and that your honesty is recognized when this matter is resolved. Crow looked at him with an expression that mingled relief with exhaustion. I should have spoken sooner. I know that. You spoke when it mattered, Holmes replied. That is not nothing. We descended the stairs in silence. Outside, the Clerkenwell Street was busy with afternoon trade. Costers pushing barrows, a knife grinder's wheel sparking, children chasing a stray dog. The ordinary world, indifferent to the quiet revolution that had just occurred above a locksmith's shop. In the cab, Holmes sat with Crow's notes across his knees, reading them a second time. The case has changed shape. Watson. We are no longer investigating a theft during a gala. We are investigating a conspiracy months, perhaps years in the making. The gala, the blackout, the smashed glass, the cello case. All of it was the final act of a much longer play. He folded the notes and tucked them away. Tomorrow we examine the electrical system. I want to know exactly how that blackout was engineered. Because if the gala was theatre, and then the darkness was the curtain call, and someone built the mechanism that brought it down, Chapter 6. The Clockwork Darkness. Holmes requested access to the basement of Lord Ashworth's mansion the following morning. Lestrade met us at Curzon Street and led us down a narrow service staircase behind the kitchen to a low-ceilinged corridor of whitewashed brick. The air was cool and metallic, carrying the smell of damp stone and copper wiring. The electrical system was Ashworth's most recent extravagance, installed only 2 months prior by Hargreaves and Sons. The main fuse box was mounted at the far end of the basement corridor, a squat iron cabinet with a heavy door and a row of ceramic fuse holders inside. Holmes opened the cabinet and stood before it in silence for a full minute, simply looking. Then he produced his lens and began a systematic examination. First the exterior of the cabinet, then the interior, then each individual fuse holder, then the wiring that entered and exited the box. He moved with the slow, absolute concentration I associated with his most productive moments, when the world outside his immediate focus simply ceased to exist. "Watson, come and look at this." I joined him at the cabinet. He was pointing to the interior of the box, at a spot behind the main circuit breaker, a heavy brass lever that, when tripped, would cut power to the entire house. Attached to the bracket supporting the lever, partially concealed by the wiring, was a small mechanism. It was no larger than a pocket watch. In fact, as Holmes carefully detached it and held it up to the lamp Lestrade had brought, I saw that it essentially was a pocket watch, or had been. The case had been removed and the movement modified. A tiny lever arm had been soldered to the minute wheel, extending outward to engage with the circuit breaker's trip mechanism. The watch face was gone, replaced by a simple dial with a single mark, and the mechanism had been set, wound, calibrated, and positioned so that at a specific time the lever arm would extend far enough to trip the breaker and plunge the house into darkness. "A clockwork timer," Holmes said, turning it slowly in his fingers. "Modified from a Swiss pocket watch movement. Good quality, reliable. The lever arm engages the circuit breaker at the appointed moment. Once the spring tension is released by the trip, the arm retracts, allowing the breaker to be reset. The entire cycle, darkness and restoration, would take approximately 90 seconds, depending on how quickly someone in the household thought to check the fuse box." 9:15, I said, recalling Lestrade's account. 9:15 precisely. The mechanism was set to activate at 9:15, the exact moment Lord Ashworth was in the ballroom delivering his toast before 200 witnesses. The timing is not coincidental. Watson, it is the alibi made mechanical. He placed the device carefully in his coat pocket and continued his examination of the fuse box and its surroundings. On the wall beside the cabinet, he found a small scratch in the whitewash, fresh at the height of a man's hand, consistent with someone bracing themselves against the wall while working in the confined space. On the floor, barely visible against the dark stone, he found a single fine curl of solder, the kind produced when a steady hand joins metal under the controlled heat of a portable soldering iron. The device was installed here, in this basement, by someone who had time, access, and sufficient skill to modify a watch movement into a precision timer. This was not the work of a moment. The soldering alone would have required 10 to 15 minutes of careful, uninterrupted labour. When could it have been installed? The basement was unlocked and accessible during the preparations for the gala. Staff moving provisions, arranging furniture, making deliveries. In the chaos of preparation, a man could spend 20 minutes in this corridor without being questioned, particularly if he appeared to belong. He paused, particularly if he was wearing a footman's uniform. We ascended to the ground floor, where Holmes requested a brief interview with Mr. Hargreaves, the household electrician, who had been summoned at Holmes's request. Hargreaves was a sturdy, plain-spoken man in his 40s, with calloused hands and the straightforward manner of a tradesman who knew his work and saw no reason to embellish it. I installed the system myself over 6 weeks, he told us. Wired every room, fitted every fixture. The fuse box is my design, custom built for the house. Lord Ashworth was very particular about it. He wanted the best, and he got it. Did you install any timing mechanism on the circuit breaker? Hargreaves looked genuinely insulted. Absolutely not. What would be the purpose of such a thing? The system is designed to be reliable, Mr. Holmes, not to turn itself off. If someone attached a timer to my fuse box, they did so without my knowledge, and without my consent. Who else had knowledge of the system's layout, the location of the fuse box, or the function of the circuit breaker? Lord Ashworth himself. He took a keen interest during the installation, asked many questions, watched the work closely. Mr. Locke, the secretary, was present for the final inspection. Beyond that, any of the household staff could have wandered down, I suppose. The basement is not restricted. Holmes thanked him, and we withdrew to the morning room, where Lestrade was waiting with tea that had gone cold, an expression of growing impatience. Well, mister. Holmes, what did you find down there? Holmes produced the clockwork device and set it on the table. Lestrade leaned forward and studied it with narrowed eyes. Good Lord, that's no malfunction. No, Inspector, it is a weapon of precision, a clockwork trigger designed to create exactly 90 seconds of darkness at exactly the right moment. It proves beyond doubt that the blackout was engineered, not accidental, and it proves premeditation of the highest order. Whoever built this device had knowledge of the electrical system, access to the basement, and the mechanical skill to modify a watch movement. This was not improvised. This was planned with the precision of a military campaign. While Holmes conferred with Lestrade over the implications, I took the opportunity to speak with several members of the household staff. I'd found, over the years, that servants often noticed things their employers did not, or rather, things their employers preferred not to have noticed. A quiet word in the kitchen or the servants' hall could yield more useful intelligence than a formal interrogation in the drawing room. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, a stout and formidable woman who had managed the household for 8 years, confirmed that the basement had been open throughout the day of the gala. Dozens of people had passed through the service areas: caterers, florists, the temporary footmen, household staff. She could not account for every individual at every moment. More interesting was the information I obtained from a parlour-maid named Ellen, a sharp-eyed young woman who had been stationed near the first-floor landing on the night of the gala, tasked with directing guests to the cloakroom. During the blackout, sir, I was on the landing. I couldn't see much. It was pitch dark, but I could hear, and I heard footsteps in the corridor leading to the conservatory. Quick, light footsteps. Not a man's tread, a woman's. Could you identify the person? When the lights came back on, I saw the Italian lady and the Contessa coming out of that corridor. She looked flushed and upset. She didn't see me. This corroborated what we already knew. The Contessa had been near the display room during the blackout, but Ellen had more. There was something else, sir. Earlier in the evening, before the blackout, I saw the Chinese lady's man, her attendant, the quiet one in the dark suit, on the service stairs, the ones that lead down to the basement. The basement stairs? You are certain? Quite certain, sir. I thought it odd at the time. Guests' attendants don't usually go below stairs. But there was so much going on, I didn't say anything. I conveyed these observations to Holmes when we reconvened in the morning room. He received them with the careful attention he always gave to my contributions, though I could see his mind was already fitting them into a larger pattern. The Contessa in the corridor, and Zhao's attendant near the basement stairs, he murmured, each near a critical location at a critical time, and yet neither, I think, is our architect. How can you be sure? Because the clockwork device in the fuse box was not installed during the gala. It was installed before, hours before, at minimum. The solder had fully cooled and oxidized. Whoever placed it there did so during the daytime preparations, not during the evening. Zhao's attendant may have been near the stairs, but the device was already in place long before he descended them. And the Contessa? The Contessa was in the corridor, yes, but the pulley mechanism had already been operated, the violin already lowered, and the glass already scattered by the time the lights returned. Her presence in the corridor during the blackout is suspicious only if we assume she acted during those 90 seconds. I believe she was there for an entirely different reason. One that has nothing to do with glass violins and everything to do with Lord Ashworth himself. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the grey Mayfair street. "We are assembling a clock, Watson. Each piece has its function, each gear its purpose. The timer tells us the blackout was engineered. The pulley tells us the violin was lowered. The cello case tells us how it left the building. Crow's notes tell us the real violin was replaced long before any of this occurred. Each mechanism points inward, toward the centre of the house, toward the man who owned every room, every key, every secret." He turned back to me. "But I need more. Suspicion without proof is merely opinion, and opinion does not satisfy the courts. There is a study in this house, Watson, that contains a fireplace. And in that fireplace, if we are fortunate, there are ashes that still have something to say." Chapter 7. Ashes and Aliases. Holmes conducted 2 separate investigations the following day, and I was present for only the second. He left Baker Street at 7:15 with a terse note on the table. "Gone to Curzon Street. Lestrade has arranged access to the study. Do not follow." S.H., I confessed to a brief sting of exclusion. But experience had taught me to trust Holmes's instincts about when he required solitude. He returned shortly after noon, his expression taut with controlled excitement. He carried a small envelope which he placed on the mantelpiece with deliberate care, as though it contained something volatile. Then he removed his coat, filled his pipe, and sat down opposite me. Ashworth was at his solicitor's again this morning. The insurance claim requires considerable paperwork, it seems. Locke was in the house, but confined to the ground floor study he uses as an office. I had the private study to myself for 3 hours. And the study is a handsome room on the 2nd floor. Leather furniture, good paintings, a partner's desk with 7 locked drawers. The locks were of inferior quality. I had them open in under a minute each. The contents were largely what one would expect of a man of Ashworth's station. Correspondence with tradesmen, invitations, receipts, a few personal letters of no great significance. He paused and reached for the envelope on the mantelpiece. But the fireplace, Watson. The fireplace was another matter entirely. He opened the envelope and withdrew a single fragment of paper, perhaps 3 inches by 4, charred black along 2 edges, the surviving text faded by heat but still partially legible. The paper was of good quality, cream-coloured, and the writing upon it was small and precise. Someone burned a considerable quantity of correspondence in that fireplace recently, within the last week I should judge, based on the ash compaction and the presence of unconsumed paper fibres in the flue. The burning was thorough, but not quite thorough enough. This fragment was lodged behind the fire basket, where the draught could not reach it. He held it to the lamp. I leaned in and read what remained. The text was fragmentary, with gaps where the fire had consumed the paper, but certain phrases were legible. The second voice arrives from K. Vary on the 12th of Monsieur Cerny confirms the commission is complete and indistinguishable from the original to any but the most. 3 years should be sufficient to allow the payment arranged through the usual channel via... The second voice, I said slowly. La voce di vetro, the voice of glass. The second voice is the replica. Precisely. And K. Veri is Karlovy Vary, a city in Bohemia renowned for its glassworks. The finest crystal in Europe outside of Venice is produced there. Monsieur Cerny is almost certainly the artisan who created the replica, a Czech glassmaker commissioned to produce a copy indistinguishable from the original. 3 years ago. 3 years ago. The date on this fragment, though partially destroyed, is consistent with 1892. Nat Ashworth commissioned a replica of his own violin 3 years before the gala. He found a master glassmaker in Cala v. Veri, arranged payment through an intermediary, and received the finished piece well in advance of his plan. He had 3 years to study the replica, to refine his scheme, to wait for the right moment. Holmes set the fragment down with the care of a man handling a loaded weapon. This is the letter he should have burned more carefully. It connects him directly to the commission of the replica, to the Czech glass works, and to the timeline of premeditation. Combined with Crow's authentication notes, which prove the replica was already in the display case weeks before the gala, we have a chain of evidence that runs from Cala v. Veri to Curzon Street. He fell silent for a moment, staring at the fragment. Then he stood abruptly. "Get your coat, Watson. We have a second appointment this afternoon. And it requires a rather different approach." Madame Lianjiao was staying at the Langham Hotel. We were admitted to her suite by her attendant, a compact, silent man who studied us with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. The sitting room was furnished with the hotel's standard elegance, supplemented by Zhao's own touches, a silk screen painted with cranes, a lacquered writing desk, and a faint scent of jasmine. Zhao herself was perhaps 50, small in stature but possessed of a presence that filled the room. She wore dark blue silk with silver embroidery, her grey-streaked hair arranged with severe precision, and her face was handsome, composed, and utterly unreadable. "Mr. Holmes, I expected this visit somewhat sooner." Her English was flawless, accented with a precision that suggested it had been learned deliberately and well. "Please sit." "You're kind, madame. I shall come directly to the point. You attended Lord Ashworth's gala, during which a glass violin of considerable value was reportedly stolen and destroyed. You were overheard that evening offering Lord Ashworth a private sum for the instrument and being refused. I am interested in the nature of that offer." Zhao's expression did not change. "I am a collector, Mr. Holmes. I collect rare musical instruments. When I encounter an exceptional piece, I make an offer. It is what collectors do. Lord Ashworth declined. That is his right. What sum did you offer?" "That is a private matter between Lord Ashworth and myself. I ask because the violin was insured for £45,000. If your offer exceeded that sum, Lord Ashworth's refusal becomes rather interesting." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not alarm, but a sharpening of attention. "I do not see why. A man who refuses a private offer exceeding his insurance value, and who then suffers a theft that allows him to collect the insurance, such a man has either extraordinary bad luck or extraordinary foresight." Zhao said nothing. She held Holmes's gaze with the composure of a woman who had conducted negotiations in every capital in Europe and did not rattle easily. Holmes changed tack. "Madame Zhao, I must tell you something that has not yet been made public. There is strong evidence to suggest that the glass violin was not destroyed on the night of the gala. The shards found on the conservatory floor were not from the original instrument. The violin may still exist, intact, somewhere beyond this house." I watched Zhao's face carefully as Holmes delivered this revelation, and what I saw, or rather, what I did not see, told me everything. There was no surprise, no shock, no widening of the eyes, no involuntary intake of breath. She received the information as one receives confirmation of something already known. Holmes saw it too. I am certain of it. His next words were measured with surgical precision. "You do not seem surprised, madame." "I have learned never to be surprised by the behaviour of wealthy men and their possessions, Mr. Holmes. Objects of great value have a way of surviving what appears to destroy them. A philosophical observation, or perhaps a practical one." She smiled, a thin, uncontrolled expression that conceded nothing. Is there anything else I can help you with? Not at present, but I may call upon you again, madame, and when I do, I suspect the conversation will be rather more specific. We departed the Langham in silence. In the cab, Holmes sat with his chin on his chest and his eyes half closed, the posture that indicated not fatigue, but the deepest concentration. She knew, I said. She knew the violin survived. The question is how she knew, and what her role in this affair truly is. He opened his eyes. Consider the position, Watson. Ashworth needs money desperately. He cannot sell the violin. The will forbids it. But if the violin is stolen and destroyed, he collects the insurance. And if the real violin is meanwhile sold privately to a collector who will never display it publicly, he collects a second fortune. The insurance pays for the loss. The private sale pays for the reality. Zhao is the buyer. Zhao is the buyer. Or she represents the buyer's interests. Her offer at the gala was a performance, a public gesture designed to establish her as a rejected suitor, so that when the violin was later discovered to have been destroyed, no one would connect her to its actual fate. She offered. She was refused. The violin was stolen. What possible connection could there be? But she must know the theft was staged. If she's buying the real violin, she knows it was never destroyed. She knows, and she does not care. Madame Zhao is not a woman troubled by the provenance of her acquisitions. She is troubled only by their authenticity, and on that count she has Ashworth's personal guarantee. Holmes paused. What she does not know, I think, is that we know, and that ignorance, Watson, may prove useful. He rapped on the cab roof. Baker Street driver. As we rattled through the evening traffic, Holmes spoke more to himself than to me. We are assembling a mosaic, Watson. Each piece alone is ambiguous. The glass shards might be explained. The curtain rod might be coincidence. Crow's notes might be error. The clockwork timer might be sabotage by a third party. The burned letter might be innocent correspondence. Zhao's composure might be natural reserve. But together they form a portrait of a very particular kind of criminal, the kind who wears the mask of the victim. He turned to the window, where the gas lamps of London slid past in the gathering dark. I know who, I know how, I know why. What I need now is the final link, the man who moved the pieces on the board while Ashworth stood in the ballroom and smiled. The phantom footman. Find him, and the chain is complete. He fell silent, and I understood that we had entered the final phase of the investigation, the quiet, dangerous interval between knowing the truth and proving it. Chapter 8. The Footman's Shadow. The staffing agency that had supplied the temporary footman for Lord Ashworth's gala was located in a cramped office above a tobacconist's shop in the Strand. The proprietor, a Mr. Gresham, was a thin, perspiring man who maintained his records with the anxious thoroughness of someone perpetually expecting an audit. He produced the relevant file within moments of Holmes's request, a folder containing the names, addresses, and references of the 6 temporary men engaged for the evening of November the 13th. Holmes examined the documents with meticulous care. 5 of the 6 entries were unremarkable. Working men with verifiable addresses in Lambeth, Bermondsey and Whitechapel, each with references from previous engagements at private households and hotels. Holmes copied their details but showed no particular interest. The 6th entry was different. John Finch, Holmes read aloud. Address, 14 Tabard Lane, Southwark. Reference, Mrs. Hathaway, housekeeper, Belgrave Square. He looked up at Gresham. How did this man come to you? Walked in, sir. 3 days before the gala. Said he had experience in service and was seeking temporary evening work. He was well-spoken, neatly dressed, had a quiet manner about him. Presented the reference from Mrs. Hathaway. I checked by post. She confirmed he had served satisfactorily at a dinner the previous month. Did you meet him in person? I did. He came to the office twice, once to register and once to collect his uniform. Dark-haired man, medium build, moved very smoothly. Almost cat-like, if you take my meaning. Soft-spoken. I remember thinking he seemed overqualified for footman's work. Too poised, too aware of his surroundings. Holmes thanked Gresham, and we departed. In the cab, he turned to me with the expression of a hound that has found the scent. The reference is genuine, Watson. I do not doubt that a man calling himself John Finch served at a dinner in Belgrave Square. Our phantom is thorough. He establishes his cover well in advance. But John Finch is not his name. It is too convenient, too ordinary, too perfectly forgettable, a professional alias. We drove to Southwark. Tabard Lane was a narrow, soot-darkened street of boarding houses and small workshops. The kind of address where a man could come and go without attracting notice. Number 14 was a 3-storey house with a blistered front door and curtains that had not been washed in some time. The landlady, Mrs. Peck, answered our knock with the suspicious wariness common to women who let rooms to strangers and had learned to expect the worst. Finch? Yes, he was here. Took the second-floor back room for a week. Paid in advance, cash. How quiet as a church mouse. I barely knew he was in the house. Left the morning after that grand party, wherever it was. Took everything with him. She paused. Well, almost everything. Almost. Left a pair of boots. Black service boots. Not his own, I'd say. Too small for him and too fine for this house. I put them in the cupboard thinking he might come back for them. He never did. Holmes's eyes sharpened. May we see the boots, Mrs. Peck? She led us up a narrow staircase to a landing cupboard and produced a pair of black leather boots, well polished, with the flat soles and low heels characteristic of indoor service footwear. They were, as Mrs. Peck had observed, of good quality. Household boots, the kind provided by a wealthy employer for temporary staff to wear during formal events. Holmes took them to the window where the light was strongest and examined them with his lens, turning each boot slowly, while studying the uppers, the stitching, the soles. He spent a full 2 minutes on the left boot sole before moving to the right. Then he knelt and held the right boot at an angle, tilting it so that the treads caught the light. Watson, look here. I knelt beside him, embedded in the grooves of the sole tread, barely visible to the naked eye but unmistakable under the lens, were fine particles of a dull yellow metal. Holmes scraped a sample onto a sheet of paper from his pocket. Brass filings, he said. Microscopic fragments of brass, ground into the rubber of the sole by pressure and friction, consistent with a man who stood on or operated a brass mechanism, such as threading a wire through a hollow brass curtain rod. He turned the boot and indicated a second substance caught in the heel tread, a faint, amber-coloured residue with a slightly sticky texture. And this is rosin. Specifically, the pine resin compound applied to the bows of stringed instruments to improve friction against the strings. It is also used to coat the interior of instrument cases to prevent moisture damage. He looked up at me. No footman has rosin on his boots, Watson, but a man who handled a cello case, who carried it, opened it, placed something inside it, and closed it again, might very well step in traces of rosin that had accumulated on the case's exterior or around its latches. He straightened and placed the boots in a cloth bag he had brought for the purpose. These boots place our phantom footman at both the curtain rod and the cello case. They are the physical link between the mechanism of the theft and the means of escape. We returned to Baker Street, Yard, where Holmes immediately retreated to his files, the extensive personal archive of criminal records, newspaper cuttings and cross-referenced dossiers he maintained in the tin dispatch boxes along the wall. He searched for nearly an hour, pulling files, scanning pages, discarding and returning. At last he extracted a slim folder and brought it to the table. Needle Jack Fenn, he announced. born Jacob Fenwick Shoreditch, 1859, a professional burglar, one of the finest in Europe if the word finest can be applied to such a vocation, specialises in theft during social events, balls, dinners, galas, exhibitions. His method is distinctive. He never uses violence, always works on commission for a patron, and invariably gains access by posing as service staff. He is called Needle for his ability to thread himself into and out of situations without leaving a trace. He laid out the file's contents, newspaper clippings from Paris, Vienna and Rome, each describing a theft at a grand social event in which valuable items vanished without explanation. A sketch from the Sûreté showed a dark-haired man of medium build, with unremarkable features and alert eyes. The description matches precisely the man Gresham met at the agency, the man Briggs logged at the door, the man Miss Price saw carrying the cello case. Jack Fenn was the hands. He installed the clockwork timer, operated the pulley, lowered the replica from the window, placed it in the cello case, scattered the pre-broken glass on the conservatory floor, and walked the violin out through the front door. But he did not conceive the plan. No, Fenn does not steal for himself. He is a craftsman for hire, the finest lockpick, the steadiest hand, at the coolest nerve in a darkened room. But he requires a patron, someone to identify the target, design the operation, provide access, and arrange payment. Someone who knew every room in that house, every lock, every electrical circuit. Someone who had 3 years to plan, and the resources to commission a replica from Bohemia. Holmes closed the file. The question is not who stole the violin, Watson. We know who stole it, Jack Fenn, under the alias John Finch, working with the precision and discretion for which he is renowned. The question is who hired the man who stole it, and every thread in this investigation, every shard of glass, every scratch in a curtain rod, every tick of a clockwork timer, every line of burned correspondence, leads to the same door. He rose and moved to the mantelpiece, where the charred fragment from Ashworth's fireplace still rested in its envelope beside the clockwork device from the fuse box. I have the mechanism. Now I have the method. I have the motive. I have the accomplice, the replica, the escape route, and the buyer. What I need now is a confession, or, failing that, a confrontation that will produce one. He turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw the cold, exhilarating clarity that preceded his most decisive actions. Tomorrow evening, Watson, I shall invite Lord Ashworth to Baker Street, and I shall invite Madame Zhao, and I shall introduce them to each other in a context neither of them expects. You intend to play them against one another. I intend to place them in a room together and remove the masks they have both been wearing. When the buyer meets the seller in the presence of the detective, Watson, the architecture of deception becomes very difficult to maintain. One of them will break, and when one breaks, the other will follow. He reached for his pen and began composing 2 letters, each carefully worded, each containing just enough truth to compel attendance, and just enough ambiguity to prevent preparation. I watched him write, and I understood that the investigation was over. What remained was the reckoning. Chapter 9. The Trap at Baker Street. The evening of November the 22nd was cold and clear, the fog having lifted for the first time in a week. Mrs. Hudson had laid a fire in the sitting room, and, at Holmes's request, arranged the chairs in a specific configuration. Holmes's armchair facing the door, 2 visitors' chairs set at angles that allowed their occupants to see each other, but not easily avoid doing so. Lestrade was positioned in Holmes's bedroom, the door left ajar. Holmes had been explicit. The inspector was to listen and not emerge until called. I sat at my writing desk, ostensibly working on my journal, but in truth watching Holmes arrange the evidence on the mantelpiece, the charred letter fragment, the clockwork timer, the cloth bag containing the boots, Crow's authentication notes, with the precision of a barrister laying out exhibits. "Ashworth will arrive at 7:30, Holmes said, consulting his watch. My message informed him that I have located the violin intact and wish to discuss its recovery privately. He will come, because he cannot afford not to. If the violin has been found, his entire scheme is in jeopardy, and he must know how much I know." "And Zhao?" 8 o'clock. A separate message, informing her that the violin she was promised may never be delivered, and inviting her to hear the circumstances. She will come because £60,000 is not a sum one abandons without investigation. "You are certain they do not know each other? That they have not communicated about your messages?" "Their arrangement was conducted entirely through intermediaries. They have never dealt with each other directly. That was the beauty of Ashworth's design. If either were questioned, neither could identify the other. But tonight, Watson, the intermediary is removed. Tonight they meet face to face, and the fiction collapses." At 7:28, we heard the bell. Footsteps on the stair. Lord Sebastian Ashworth entered, immaculate as always. Dark evening coat, white cravat, silver hair, perfectly ordered. But his eyes moved immediately to the mantelpiece where the evidence was displayed, and something flickered there, the swift assessment of a man determining how much danger he was in. "Mr. Holmes, you said you have located my violin." "I said I wish to discuss its recovery. Please sit down. A Lord Ashworth." Ashworth settled into the chair with the controlled grace of a man who understood that composure was his most important weapon. He crossed his legs and regarded Holmes with an expression of expectant concern, the wronged owner, eager for good news. Holmes did not sit. He stood before the fire, his back to the mantelpiece, and spoke with the quiet authority of a man who has no need to raise his voice because every word carries the weight of certainty. "Lord Ashworth, I've spent the past 10 days investigating the theft of La Voce di Vetro. I should like to share my findings with you, as the violin's owner and the victim of this crime." "Of course." "The glass shards found on your conservatory floor are not from La Voce di Vetro. They are modern Czech glass, almost certainly from the same Bohemian glassworks that produced a replica of the violin. A replica you commissioned 3 years ago from a craftsman named E.M., a Cerny in Karlovy Vary." The first crack appeared. Ashworth's right hand, resting on the arm of his chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. His expression did not change. "The violin was not stolen on the night of the gala," Holmes continued. "It was removed from the display case weeks before, replaced by the replica. When Mr. Tobias Crowe examined the instrument for authentication, he was examining the copy, not the original. He documented anomalies consistent with modern Czech manufacture in his private notes, which are now in my possession." Holmes reached to the mantelpiece and held up the clockwork device. The blackout at 9:15 was not a malfunction. It was engineered by this mechanism. A modified pocket watch attached to your circuit breaker, designed to cut power at the precise moment you were delivering your toast in the ballroom. Your alibi was not a fortunate coincidence. It was part of the design. He set down the timer and picked up the cloth bag. During those 90 seconds of darkness, your hired accomplice, a professional burglar known as Needle Jack Fenn, operating under the alias John Finch, entered the conservatory, lowered the replica through the window via a pulley system concealed inside the decorative curtain rod, and scattered pre-broken glass on the floor to simulate the violin's destruction. The replica was received in the alley below, placed inside a cello case that had been introduced with the musician's equipment, and walked out through your front door at 9:45, logged by your own doorman. He held up the charred fragment. "And in your fireplace, I found correspondence referencing the second voice, your term for the replica, its delivery from Karlovy Vary, and a date 3 years prior." The room was silent. The fire ticked and settled. Ashworth sat motionless, his face a mask of controlled composure. But the colour had drained from beneath the mask. His eyes, those steady pale blue eyes, had gone flat. "This is a remarkable theory, Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was level, but I detected the faintest tremor beneath the polish. "But it is a theory. Circumstantial evidence interpreted through a particular lens. Glass composition can vary. Curtain rods can be scratched by curtain hooks. Clockwork devices can be planted by anyone. And burned letters cannot be read with certainty." "You are quite right," Holmes said. "Taken individually, each piece of evidence is ambiguous. That is why I have arranged for you to hear them together, and why I have invited one additional guest this evening." Ashworth's composure, so carefully maintained, faltered for the first time. "What guest?" The bell rang below. Holmes did not answer. He stood perfectly still, his eyes on Ashworth's face, and waited. The footsteps ascended the staircase, lighter than Ashworth's, measured and deliberate. Mrs. Hudson opened the door. Madame Lianzhou entered the sitting-room in black silk, carrying herself with customary poise. Her gaze swept the room, found Holmes, found me, and then found Ashworth. She stopped. Ashworth's face drained of whatever colour remained. He looked at Zhao, and Zhao looked at him, and in that instant the elaborate fiction, the intermediaries, the coded communications, the careful distance, collapsed like a house of cards. "You know each other," Holmes said. It was not a question. Zhao recovered first. A rapid, ruthless calculation crossed her eyes, the mind of a woman accustomed to salvaging what could be salvaged. "Mr. Holmes, I came here in good faith. I did not expect to find Lord Ashworth in your sitting-room." "No, and Lord Ashworth did not expect to find you. That is precisely the point." Holmes gestured to the second chair. "Please, sit down. Madam, I believe Lord Ashworth was about to explain how a violin he claims was stolen and destroyed came to be offered for private sale to you for £60,000. The silence that followed was the most charged I have ever experienced in that room, and I had been present for many of Holmes's revelations. Ashworth stared at Zhao. Zhao stared at Holmes. The fire crackled. Then Zhao sat down, smoothed her skirts, and spoke with the cold precision of a woman cutting her losses. 6 months ago, I was approached by an intermediary, a Mr. Havel, operating out of Vienna, who informed me that a private collector wished to sell a glass violin of extraordinary provenance. The asking price was £60,000. I paid a deposit of £10,000 through Havel's account. I was told the instrument would be delivered after a public event had established its disappearance. Ashworth closed his eyes. "I did not know the theft was to be staged," Zhao continued. "I was told the owner wished to sell discreetly, outside the terms of a restrictive will, and that the public disappearance would provide cover. I did not ask questions. The provenance was authentic. The price was acceptable." "You knew you were buying a stolen object," Holmes said. "I knew I was buying an object whose owner wished it to appear stolen. The distinction may be legal rather than moral, but it exists." Holmes turned to Ashworth. The lord sat with his eyes still closed, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, the mask finally and completely gone. What remained was not defiance or cunning, but the quiet exhaustion of a man whose architecture had collapsed around him. "It is over, Lord Ashworth," Holmes said, not unkindly. Ashworth opened his eyes. He looked at Holmes, then at me, then at the evidence arrayed on the mantelpiece. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of performance, raw, weary, and strangely dignified in its defeat. "My father left me the estate, the violin, and debts I did not discover until it was too late. 30 years of poor investments, gambling losses, obligations I could not refuse. The estate is mortgaged to the chimney pots. The violin was the only thing of value I possessed, but the will forbids its sale. If I sell, I forfeit everything. But if it was stolen, destroyed beyond recovery, I collect the insurance, £45,000. And if the real violin is sold privately to a buyer who will never display it, 60,000 more, enough to settle every debt. You commissioned the replica 3 years ago. I spent 6 months finding the right craftsman. Cerny and Karlovy Vary. A genius, Mr. Holmes. The replica was magnificent. I swapped the real violin for the copy myself. At night, alone. I hired Fenn through contacts I would rather not name. I planned every detail. The gala, the lights, the timing, the cello case. 3 years of planning for 90 seconds of darkness. He looked down at his hands. I thought it was perfect. It very nearly was, Holmes said quietly. Lestrade. The bedroom door opened, and the inspector stepped into the sitting room. Ashworth did not move. He sat in his chair at 221B Baker Street, surrounded by the ruins of his deception, and accepted the words Lestrade spoke to him with the stillness of a man who had been running for a very long time, and had finally, at last, been permitted to stop. Chapter 10, La Voce di Vetro. The weeks that followed the evening at Baker Street brought a swift and thorough reckoning. Lord Sebastian Ashworth was charged with insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and perversion of the course of justice. He was held at Bow Street Magistrates' Court and remanded to Holloway pending trial. The newspapers naturally were ravenous. The story of a lord who had stolen his own priceless violin, staged an elaborate theatrical robbery at his own gala, hired a professional burglar, and attempted to defraud an insurance company of £45,000, was precisely the sort of scandal that sold papers by the crate. The Times devoted 3 columns to it. The Illustrated London News ran an artist's impression of the Baker Street confrontation that bore no resemblance whatsoever to what had actually occurred, she depicting Holmes in a deerstalker he did not own, and Ashworth in a posture of melodramatic horror that would have been beneath the man even in his darkest moment. Lestrade, as was his custom, accepted a generous share of the public credit. Holmes permitted this without comment, as he always did. I had long since ceased to be irritated by this arrangement. Holmes's satisfaction lay in the solution, not in the applause. And Lestrade's career benefited from the association in ways that kept Scotland Yard well disposed toward our future involvement. Needle Jack Fenn was apprehended 2 weeks after Ashworth's arrest at a boarding house in Calais. He was carrying forged Belgian papers, a considerable sum in French banknotes, and a small leather case containing the tools of his trade, a set of lockpicks of remarkable craftsmanship, a coil of fine steel wire, and a portable soldering iron. He offered no resistance. When informed that Ashworth had confessed, Fenn reportedly shrugged and said, "The gentleman paid well. It was a fine job while it lasted." He was extradited to England and charged as an accessory. The real glass violin, La Voce di Vetro, the voice of glass, was recovered from a private vault in a Zurich bank, where Ashworth had arranged for it to be held until Madame Zhao completed payment. The instrument was intact, undamaged, and as luminous as the day Marcello Contarini had shaped it from molten cristallo in his Venetian workshop a century and a half before. It was returned to England under armed escort. And here the violin story took its final, unexpected turn. Under the terms of the Ashworth family will, the violin was to remain in the family collection or be donated to the British Museum. Lord Ashworth's criminal conviction constituted a forfeiture of his claim to the estate and its contents. The executors, after considerable legal deliberation, determined that the violin should pass to the museum. It was installed in a specially constructed case in the European Decorative Arts Gallery, where it could be viewed by any citizen who cared to visit. A small brass plaque noted its provenance, its history, and the circumstances of its recovery, though it tactfully omitted the name of Sherlock Holmes. The loose ends of the affair resolved themselves with varying degrees of neatness. The Contessa Eleonora Visconti was cleared entirely. Holmes had been correct in his suspicion that her presence near the conservatory corridor during the blackout had nothing to do with the violin. She had gone to find Ashworth, not to confront him about the instrument, but to confront him about their ended affair. They had been lovers for 2 years, a relationship conducted in secret and concluded bitterly some month before the gala. The Contessa had come that evening intending to demand an explanation for his sudden coldness. In the darkness of the blackout, she had moved toward the conservatory, believing Ashworth might have retreated there. She found nothing, and when the lights returned, she was seen emerging from the corridor with the flushed, distressed expression of a woman whose private anguish had momentarily overwhelmed her public composure. She returned to Venice shortly after Ashworth's arrest, but I learned from Holmes, who maintained certain correspondences I was not always privy to, that the British Museum had opened discussions with the Italian government regarding the Contarini family's historical claim to the violin. Whether anything would come of this, Holmes could not say, but the Contessa's long campaign had not been entirely in vain. Phineas Locke, Ashworth's private secretary, was exposed as an embezzler. The financial audit triggered by the insurance investigation, the very scrutiny Locke had feared, revealed that he had been siphoning small but steady amounts from Ashworth's accounts for nearly 4 years. The total was modest by the standards of Ashworth's debts, but sufficient to constitute a serious criminal offence. Locke was dismissed and charged. Holmes observed with characteristic dryness that Locke's frantic helpfulness during the investigation and his suspicious behaviour, the ink-stained cuffs, the burned papers in the study, had been the desperate efforts of a man trying to conceal his own crime, while the house was searched for evidence of another. He was not our thief, Watson, but he was a thief. The investigation merely exposed the wrong one first. Tobias Crowe, the luthier, was vindicated. His private authentication notes, which had proven so crucial to Holmes's case, were presented to the court as evidence of his professional integrity. Far from being accused of the swap he had feared, Crowe was recognised as the one expert who had identified the truth. Holmes personally recommended him for a consultancy position at the British Museum, advising on the care and authentication of musical instruments in the National Collection. Crowe accepted, and I am told he approaches the work with the fierce dedication of a man who has been given a second chance at recognition. Madame Lian Zhao cooperated with investigators regarding the network of intermediaries through which the private sale had been arranged. She provided names, dates, and financial records that proved valuable in mapping a broader web of illicit antiquities transactions across Europe. Her fate, however, remained ambiguous. Holmes suspected, and I shared his suspicion, that a woman of Zhao's resources, connections, and intelligence would find a way to distance herself from the criminal proceedings. She departed London before the trial and was last reported in Shanghai, where extradition was, to put it diplomatically, unlikely. She will not face justice, Holmes remarked. But then her crime was greed, not malice. She purchased what was offered. It is Ashworth who conceived the deception, and it is Ashworth who will bear the consequences. It was a grey December afternoon, some 3 weeks after the arrest, when I raised the question that had nagged at me since the beginning. Holmes and I were at Baker Street, the fire burning low, the remains of Mrs. Hudson's excellent seed cake between us. Holmes was tuning his violin, his own violin, of wood and gut and horsehair, as far removed from Contarini's crystalline masterpiece as a sparrow from a swan. "Holmes," I said, "what first made you suspect Ashworth? Before the glass, before the curtain rod, before any of the evidence. When Lestrade sat in that chair and described the case, I saw something in your face, a flicker of doubt about the obvious narrative. What was it?" Holmes set down his bow and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The glass, Watson. Always the glass." He rose and moved to the window, where the December light was fading over the rooftops. When Lestrade described the scene, the shattered remains of a priceless, irreplaceable instrument scattered across a marble floor, I asked myself a simple question. How would a man react to such a sight? A man who had inherited that violin, who had displayed it, insured it, built an evening around its public unveiling. He would be destroyed. He would fall to his knees. He would gather every fragment with his bare hands, cutting his fingers on the shards, desperate to save what could not be saved. Grief, Watson, real grief, is not dignified. It is not measured. It is ugly and raw, and it does not care about appearances. He turned back to me, and then I met Ashworth, and he stood in his conservatory amid the wreckage of what he called the soul of his family's collection, and his hands were steady, his voice was controlled, his grief was precise, beautifully calibrated, perfectly performed, and entirely hollow. He looked at that broken glass with the detachment of a man looking at a mess he himself had made. He returned to his chair and picked up his bow. Grief cannot be forged as easily as glass, Watson. That is where the deception began to fail. Not in the chemistry of the shards or the mechanics of the pulley, but in the silence of a man who did not weep for something he should have loved. He drew the bow across the strings, and a single note filled the room, warm, wooden, imperfect, alive. The sound of a real instrument, played by hands that understood its worth. I opened my journal and wrote the final lines of the account. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning to fall over Baker Street, covering the city in a silence as white and as delicate as glass. Somewhere in the British Museum, behind beveled panels and soft lighting, a violin that had survived wars, thefts, forgeries, and the worst impulses of its custodians stood in its case and caught the light, transparent, luminous, and finally where it belonged, not hidden in a vault, not locked in a private collection, not shattered on a marble floor, visible for anyone who cared to look.